What if the language a people spoke for thousands of years was actually proof that they didn't originally belong where history placed them? Not in a threatening way, not in a they don't deserve their homeland way, but in a wait, the earth itself kept a secret this whole time kind of way. That's exactly what happened with the Cherokee. And when scientists finally cracked the code, using linguistics, genetics, and ancient bones from the Missouri River, the answer was so precise, so converging, that it borderline shouldn't be possible. Three completely separate fields of science. Three completely different types of evidence, all pointing at the exact same spot on the map. Let's talk about that. Picture the southern Appalachian Mountains in October. You've got ridge after ridge fading into the distance, each one a deeper shade of blue-gray than the last. Hardwood forests lit up in copper and gold. It's the kind of landscape that makes you stop walking just to stare. For thousands of years, this was Cherokee country, western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, the high valleys of northern Georgia. It felt ancient. It felt like it had always been that way. And for a long time, that's exactly what historians and anthropologists assumed. The Cherokee were a southeastern people. Deep roots in the mountains, in the rivers, in the mound sites and village remained scattered across the Blue Ridge. Simple story, clean narrative. Then someone actually looked at the language, and things got complicated fast. Cherokee is an Iroquoian language. Now, that might not mean much to you right now, so let me give you some context. The rest of the Iroquoian language family, the Mohawk, the Seneca, the Oneida, the Tuscarora, all lived more than 800 miles to the north and east. We're talking the Great Lakes, upstate New York, the St. Lawrence Valley, cold winters, birch bark canoes, completely different ecological world. The Cherokee were sitting alone in the deep south, speaking a language that had absolutely no business being there. Linguistically, they were an island, a family of one, stranded 1,000 miles from their closest linguistic cousins. Linguists noticed this back in the 1800s. By the early 20th century, they were already asking out loud, how does an Iroquoian-speaking people end up in Appalachia? The answer they landed on was vague, maybe a prehistoric migration, maybe an ancient split from the main group. Nobody could pin down the details because the tools to answer that question precisely simply didn't exist yet. Archaeology could map pottery styles and settlement patterns. Linguistics could estimate that the Cherokee probably split from the northern Iroquoian group somewhere around 3,500 to 4,000 years ago, late Archaic period. But neither field could tell you who moved, how many people, or what route they took. Then came DNA, and the answers it gave back were anything but simple. Here's something most people outside of genetics research don't know. When scientists first started cataloging Native American mitochondrial DNA, which traces ancestry through the maternal line, through mothers and grandmothers going back tens of thousands of years, they built a remarkably clean system. For founding lineage groups, labeled A, B, C, and D, each one traceable to East Asian source populations. Each one consistent with people crossing the Beringia land bridge from Siberia during the last ice age, roughly 15,000 or more years ago. About 97% of all Native American maternal lineages fell neatly into one of those four boxes. The model was elegant. Papers were published. Textbooks were printed. Scientists moved on. Then the remaining 3% started causing headaches. A fifth lineage kept showing up, haplogroup X. And haplogroup X did not behave like the other four. Haplogroups A through D all have clear parallels in East Asian populations. Exactly what you'd expect if every founding lineage crossed from Siberia. But haplogroup X? Its closest relatives were in Europe and Western Asia, the Middle East, the Caucasus, populations that have nothing to do with the Siberian crossing, at least not in the traditional model. Now, and I have to pause here because this is where things get hijacked. Every few years, someone takes this data and tries to spin it into some pseudoscientific story. Ancient Israelites in the Americas, European colonizers thousands of years before Columbus. Indigenous people aren't really indigenous. I want to be crystal clear. None of that is what the data says. None of it. These theories are not just wrong. They're deliberately crafted to undermine indigenous land rights and identity, and they don't survive a single serious look at the actual evidence. What the data actually shows is far more interesting and far more honest. In 1999, two research teams published landmark studies almost simultaneously. Michael Brown and his colleagues at Emory University, and David Glenn Smith's team at the University of California, Davis. Both had been independently tracking haplogroup X across Native American populations, and both reached the exact same conclusion. The Native American X lineage, designated X2A, is real. It is not European contamination. It is not the result of colonial-era intermarriage. It diverged from its Eurasian counterpart at least 15,000 years ago, probably longer. That divergent state is everything. It means haplogroup X was already a distinct, separate lineage before any human being set foot in the Americas. It didn't drift in from Europe later. It arrived with the original founders. But here's where it reconnects to the Cherokee. When Smith's team mapped the distribution of haplogroup X across native North American populations, the geographic pattern was striking. It wasn't spread evenly across the continent. It concentrated heavily in the Great Lakes region, among Algonquian and Iroquoian-speaking peoples, the Ojibwe, the Sioux, the Nuu-chah-nulth, and it appeared at lower but notable frequencies in Cherokee populations, the same geographic footprint that the language had already pointed to. If you're someone who pays attention when two completely independent lines of evidence land on the same answer, sit up, because the Cherokee were not supposed to be genetically connected to the Great Lakes. They were supposed to be southeastern, Appalachian, local. The linguistic puzzle was already strange enough. Now the DNA was drawing the same circle around the same region. 3 years after those haplogroup X studies, a young researcher named Ripon Malley at UC Davis was doing something nobody had attempted at that scale. He and his team were assembling mitochondrial DNA data from across the entire continent. Not just one tribe or one region, but dozens of populations from the Arctic all the way down to the Gulf Coast. Over 1,600 samples, nearly 400 full sequences of the hypervariable segment, which is the most information-dense part of mitochondrial DNA for tracking ancestry. It was the largest dataset anyone had ever assembled at the time. When the team ran their spatial analysis, plotting haplogroup frequencies against geography, the continent organized itself into 3 distinct genetic clusters. Haplogroup A populations had expanded across the Arctic North. Haplogroup B populations clustered in the southwest. And haplogroup X populations had expanded around the Great Lakes. Picture that result appearing on a screen. A map of North America. The Great Lakes region lighting up for haplogroup X. Now picture overlaying a second map, the known distribution of Iroquoian languages before European contact. The overlap isn't approximate, it's precise. And here's why that matters so much. The distribution of haplogroup X overlaps exactly with the region where linguists place Proto-Iroquoian, the ancestral language before the Cherokee branch split away. The Great Lakes, the Northeast Corridor, the very territory that Cherokee oral traditions describe as their homeland before migration south. 3 data points: linguistics, genetics, oral tradition, all pointing at the same map coordinates. Then in 2011, the evidence got even more specific from the most unexpected direction. At Washington State University, Deborah Balnick and Brian Kemp were working on what looked like a side project. They had access to skeletal remains from 3 Iroquois village sites along the Missouri River in South Dakota, sites occupied between 1600 and 1832. The Iroquois speak a Cadone language, completely different family from Iroquoian, completely different from Siouan. On paper, there was no reason whatsoever to expect any Cherokee connection. They extracted mitochondrial DNA from 63 samples. 55 yielded usable data. The 4 major haplogroups appeared at expected frequencies. But then the team ran something called principal coordinates analysis, a statistical method that places populations in multidimensional space based on how genetically similar they are to each other. Closer points mean more shared ancestry. The Iroquois clustered closest to 2 populations, the Siouan-speaking peoples, and the Cherokee, not the Pawnee, their nearest geographic and cultural neighbors, not the Mandan, who lived right along the same river system. The Iroquois' deepest maternal genetic affinities were with groups hundreds of miles away, groups from 2 supposedly unrelated language families. There's a controversial hypothesis in linguistics called the Macro-Siouan theory, which argues that Iroquoian, Siouan, and Cadone languages all share a single deep common ancestor. Most linguists have considered it and proven for decades. Balnick and Kemp's DNA data didn't prove it either, but it made dismissing it significantly harder. Think about what you're looking at now. Three groups, separated by hundreds of miles, speaking languages from three supposedly unrelated families. And their deep maternal lineages are telling a story of shared ancient ancestry, not recent contact, not trade routes, not intermarriage over a few generations. Ancient shared ancestry, the kind that predates the divergence of the languages themselves. Taken together, what this evidence shows is that Cherokee maternal lineages carry the genetic signatures of a northern origin, specifically the Great Lakes corridor, consistent with a population migration southward into the Appalachians roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. What it rules out is the old assumption that the Cherokee were simply an in-place southeastern people whose roots were entirely local. The patterns can't be explained by staying put. What it implies is extraordinary. A population movement large enough to establish both a language and a genetic footprint in the southern Appalachians, happening during the late Archaic period, reshaping the cultural landscape of the entire Southeast long before Mississippian civilization even emerged. But here's where I have to be honest with you, because a good story isn't the same as a closed case. Mitochondrial DNA traces only the maternal line, one thread of ancestry. It says nothing about paternal lineage, nothing about the full autosomal picture, the other 99% of your genome. A population can carry northern maternal lineages and still have deep local roots through other lines. Migration is complicated. Sustained intermarriage across centuries can produce genetic signals that look similar to a single large migration. Mitochondrial data alone can't always tell the difference. There's also a sampling problem that genuinely complicates the data. Most Cherokee DNA studies have used modern Cherokee populations, primarily citizens of the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. But the Trail of Tears in 1838 forcibly relocated approximately 16,000 Cherokee from their southeastern homeland to Indian Territory. An estimated 4,000 people died during the removal, 1 in 4. That is a devastating population bottleneck. The genetic profile of modern Oklahoma Cherokee may not accurately represent the full pre-contact diversity of the Cherokee people. Lineages that were common before removal might have vanished simply because their carriers happened to be among those who died. Lineages that were rare might appear overrepresented because their carriers happened to survive. Bottlenecks reshape everything in population genetics. This isn't a small technicality, it's a real limitation. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina, descendants of those who evaded or avoided removal, offers a different genetic window. But that population is smaller, and sampling has been limited. This is where the story becomes genuinely frustrating, because the evidence we need most, ancient DNA from pre-contact archaeological sites in the Cherokee homeland, barely exists yet. The technology is there. Researchers have extracted and sequenced ancient DNA from remains across the Americas. The science can distinguish between a single large migration and a gradual centuries-long process. It can identify when outside cultural contact, like the rise of Mississippian civilization, reshaped genetic diversity. The answers are within reach. What's required isn't a better microscope. It's trust. Indigenous communities across North America have legitimate, deep historical reasons to be cautious about genetic research. For decades, studies were conducted without informed consent. Samples were taken from ancestral remains without community permission. Results were published that contradicted cultural knowledge or were later used to challenge land rights. The Cherokee Nation, along with many other tribal nations, now maintains strict protocols around any genetic research involving their citizens or their ancestors. Any ancient DNA study in the Cherokee homeland has to be conducted in genuine partnership with the tribe, not just ethical sign-off on paper, but actual collaborative direction of the research questions. Several such partnerships are reportedly in development, and when they happen, the resolution on this story is going to sharpen dramatically. There's one more thing worth mentioning, because it connects to something a lot of people have experienced personally. The explosion of commercial DNA testing over the past decade has flooded public conversation with real misunderstandings about what these tests can actually tell you about Cherokee ancestry specifically. Millions of Americans have claimed Cherokee heritage based on consumer test results. But those kits estimate regional ancestry by comparing your DNA to reference panels. And the reference panels for Native American populations are notoriously thin and imprecise. A consumer test cannot confirm Cherokee ancestry. It can barely confirm Native American ancestry in many cases. The real science, conducted in partnership with tribal nations, using controlled sampling and ancient DNA protocols, operates on a completely different level of rigor. And it's that science, not the kit you spit into at your kitchen table, that's actually rewriting this history. Right now, somewhere under the forest soil of the southern Appalachians, there are archaeological sites sitting quietly. Sites that contain the physical record of one of North America's most significant prehistoric migrations. And somewhere in laboratories and tribal council offices, conversations are happening about whether and how to read that evidence. The Cherokee Nation today has over 450,000 citizens. It runs its own government, its own courts, its own language revitalization programs. And it is increasingly engaging with genetic science on its own terms, not as subjects of someone else's study, but as partners directing the questions being asked. Here's the thing that gets me every time I sit with this story. The Cherokee have always known they came from the north. Their oral traditions said so. Their Kituwa stories carried that memory forward across generations, long before anyone invented a DNA sequencer or coined the term mitochondrial haplogroup. It took Western science 3,500 years of linguistic puzzles, 2 decades of painstaking mitochondrial mapping, and the development of ancient DNA extraction technology to arrive at the same conclusion the Cherokee already held. The question now isn't where they came from. It's what the journey actually looked like, the route, the timeline, the people they met, the cultures they built along the way. And for the first time, the people whose ancestors made that journey are helping to lead the search for answers. That's not just good science. That's how history should work.